She fed a ragged traveler her last stew. He returned to buy the whole homestead. The bowl she set in front of me that night had 2 chunks of potato in it, a little gristle of something that might have been rabbit, and a broth so thin you could see the bottom of the crockery through it. I knew what that meant. I'd eaten enough lean winters to know the difference between a woman who'd cooked light and a woman who'd cooked everything she had. I didn't say anything about it. That would have been an insult. I ate it slow, the way a man eats when he's trying to make the meal last longer than it is. Outside, the wind was doing what wind does in that country in late October, running hard off the flats, rattling whatever isn't nailed down, looking for a way inside. The lamp on the table threw a circle of orange light that didn't reach the corners of the room. I could hear the boy upstairs. He'd coughed twice since she brought me in from the door, and each time she'd tilted her head toward the ceiling the way a mother does, listening to decide if she needed to go up. She didn't need to go up. She sat across from me with her hands around a cup that I don't think had anything in it, just something to hold. She was watching me eat the way people watch when they're too proud to say what they're thinking, which was that she wasn't sure she'd been smart letting a stranger through that door. Her name was Adeline Crow. She told me that before she told me anything else, like it was the first card she was laying on the table. Mine was Gideon Marsh. I'd been a lot of things before I was what I was that night, which was a man on a played-out horse with $7 and some change in his coat pocket, and a letter in his saddlebag that had taken 2 months to catch up to me, and turned out to be the deed to 80 acres of hardpan in a county I'd never been to. Left to me by an uncle I'd met twice. I wasn't sure yet whether to be grateful. I'd come off the main road because my horse had thrown a shoe and the light was going and her place was the first smoke I'd seen in 6 miles. That was all of it. No design. Just a thrown shoe and a cold sky going dark and a woman's chimney smoke. She let me in because she had a rule about travelers. She told me that night, and I've thought about it since. Her husband, dead 3 years by then, consumption, left her with the boy and the land and the debt, and not a neighbor closer than 4 miles. Her husband had come to her father's farm once as a young man, stranded and broke in a hard winter, and her father had fed him and put him in the barn, and by spring he'd stayed on as a hand, and by summer he'd been something else, and the next winter he'd asked her father for permission, and that was how she'd come to be. She said her father always held to the idea that a man who turns a stranger away in the cold is buying bad luck on credit. She'd taken it as her own rule, even now. Even with the boy upstairs and the stew pot scraped to the bottom and no way to know what I was. I finished the bowl. She asked if I wanted more. I said I was fine, thank you, which was the truth in the sense that a man can be fine without being full. She didn't have a barn in working order. The roof of it had half caved in the previous spring from snow load, and she hadn't had the lumber or the labor to put it right. There was a lean-to on the south side of the house where she kept her 2 remaining milk cows, and she said I could put my horse in there if I didn't mind the cows' company. She gave me a blanket that smelled of cedar, a candle stub, and told me there was a basin outside the lean-to door if I wanted to wash. I thanked her. She said nothing needed thanking. She was already halfway up the stairs to check on the boy. I lay in the lean-to that night on a bed of straw between 2 warm cows and listened to the wind work on the siding. The candle went out in an hour. Somewhere in the dark I heard her up again, the floorboards above me, and the low voice she used with the boy that you could hear the shape of without making out the words. After a while the coughing stopped and the floor went quiet, and I lay there in the black and thought about the kind of tired that isn't sleep tired. That's the other kind. The kind that comes from holding something up for too long by yourself. I was gone before she was up. I left 50 cents on the step, all the coin I felt I could spare without making the gesture ring false, and I rode for the county seat to find a lawyer who could explain to me what exactly I'd inherited. That was the 2nd of November. I didn't go back to Adeline Crow's place for 8 months. The land my uncle left me was hardpan, like I said, but it had a creek running through the northeast corner that nobody seemed to have noticed on any official survey, which meant it had water when the rest of the county was praying for it. I'd figured that out by April. By June, I'd proved it to a cattle buyer out of San Antonio named Whitfield, who was willing to stake me to a small herd in exchange for grazing rights and a cut of the calves come spring. It wasn't wealth, but it was ground to stand on. And I was a man who'd gone 30 years without ground to stand on, so I knew the difference. The letter had said 80 acres. When I had the survey done proper, it came back at 112. My uncle had never been exact about things. I worked that summer harder than I'd worked since I was young enough to do it without feeling it the next morning. I had a man named Teobaldo working for me, a Mexican with 20 years of cow sense, and a habit of whistling the same 4 bars of something over and over while he worked. And between the two of us, we put up a decent set of pens and a usable bunkhouse and ran the fence lines where they needed running. Whitfield sent up 18 head in July, and I watched them water at the creek and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something that didn't have a clean name. August, I went into town for wire and lumber, and I heard a man at the feed store talking about the Crow place, over on the county line, how the widow was about to lose it. Bank note come due, and she was 3 payments behind. The bank man from Laredo was coming up in October to put it to her plain. Either she made it right or they'd take the property and give her 60 days. I bought my wire and my lumber and drove back to my place and didn't think about it for 2 days. Then I thought about it for the next week without stopping. It wasn't complicated, what I was thinking. It was actually very simple, which is sometimes why a thing is hard to sit with. I had money now, more than I'd expected by August, because the summer had gone well and Whitfield had paid me ahead for next season's grazing. I could clear her note. Not just the 3 payments, the whole remaining balance. I'd done the math without meaning to, riding fence lines, and I knew what I could do. The question was what it meant to do it. She didn't know me. She'd fed a stranger 1 bowl of thin stew and sent him to sleep in her lean-to, and 8 months had gone by, and if she thought of me at all it was probably as the man who'd left 50 cents on her step, which was fair. I hadn't written. I hadn't sent word. I'd ridden off before dawn like a man with somewhere else to be, which I was. What I was thinking about doing was something else entirely. I went into the county seat and talked to a lawyer named Dills who I'd used for the survey. I told him what I wanted to do, and he looked at me over his spectacles for a moment the way lawyers look at you when they're deciding if you're serious. Then he told me it was a clean transaction, legal and straightforward, and he could draw up the papers if I wanted. I told him I wanted to think about it another day. I didn't need another day. I already knew. I just wanted to be honest with myself about why. The reason wasn't charity. I want to be clear about that. I had no interest in giving a woman something she hadn't asked for out of pity, because pity wasn't what I felt and charity was the kind of gesture that puts distance between people, and distance wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was harder to say, and I wasn't practiced at saying it. I'd spent 30 years moving. Ranch to ranch, drive to drive, winter camp to spring camp, never in one place long enough to grow roots or owe anyone anything or have anyone owe me. It had suited me once. It had stopped suiting me sometime around my 48th year, and I hadn't done a thing about it. What I wanted was to be the man who rode back. That was it, not the man who passed through, not the man who took what was offered and left 50 cents on a step and disappeared. The man who came back. The man who, when a woman with a sick kid and a failing place and a lamp burning in the cold had opened her door because her dead husband had wandered in out of a winter storm 30 years ago, and her father had taught her to let strangers in, when that woman had fed me her last stew, I wanted to be the kind of man whose answer to that was something real. I went back to Dills and told him to draw up the papers. I rode out to her place on the 14th of September, a Tuesday, in the late afternoon. The sky was that hard, clean blue you get after a week of rain. The road had dried out, but there were still mud ruts from the wagons, and my horse picked his way careful. I'd had him reshod in the spring, and he was a different animal for it. That struck me as I rode, the thrown shoe that night in October, the chain of small chances. A different shoe and I'm on a different road, and none of this happens. I didn't know what I was going to say. I'd thought about it plenty and hadn't gotten anywhere useful, so I'd let it go. She was in the yard when I rode up, splitting wood. She had on a heavy canvas coat and her hair was tied back, and she was working with the focused efficiency of a person who has been splitting their own wood long enough to do it without thinking. She set them all down when she saw me coming, and stood there watching me ride up with an expression that was neither welcoming nor unfriendly, just waiting to see. I stepped down and tied my horse to the fence post and took my hat off. She didn't know me. That was clear from the way she was looking at me, the careful, watchful look of a woman alone who is deciding whether to keep her distance. I said last October, you let me in out of the cold, thin stew and your lean-to. My horse had thrown a shoe. She looked at me another moment and then something shifted in her face. She said, you left 50 cents. I said that was me. She said, that was more than you had to leave. I said it wasn't, and I meant it. There was a pause. The wind moved through the yard and lifted a few dry leaves along the fence line. Up at the house I could see a curtain move, the boy watching. I told her I'd heard about her situation with the bank. I said it plain, the way I'd decided to, because there was no good way to soften it, and softening it would have felt like maneuvering. I told her I'd come into some land and worked a decent season, and I had the means to clear her note if she'd allow it. The whole remaining balance. I'd talked to a lawyer and the papers were ready. She didn't say anything for a moment. The way she held herself changed, got a little stiffer. I knew that look too. It was pride getting its back up, which I'd expected and which I respected. She said, why? Not how or when or what's the arrangement, just why. I thought about what I'd worked out in my own head and I said, because you opened your door when you didn't have to, and I have it to give, and I'd like to stay. That last part I hadn't planned to say that early. It came out anyway. She looked at me for a long time. I held her gaze because I wasn't going to look away from it, whatever she decided. She said, stay where? I said I had 112 acres about 6 miles east with a bunkhouse and good water and room for more cattle, and I would need a cook if she was willing. And if she wasn't willing to call it that, she could call it something else. But either way, I wasn't asking for anything she wasn't prepared to give, and I wasn't going anywhere. The boy had come out on the porch by then. 8 years old, maybe 9. Dark-haired like her, standing there with his hands in his pockets looking at me the way boys look at a man they're not sure about yet. She looked at the boy. Then she looked back at me. She said, come inside, I'll put coffee on. It wasn't yes, not yet, but it was the door open again, which was how it had started, and I figured that was enough to walk through. I went back the next day with Dills and we sat at her kitchen table and she read through every line of the papers herself slowly and asked 2 questions that were sharp and sensible and showed she understood what she was signing. Dills answered them straight and she seemed satisfied with his answers. She signed. I paid. The bank note was cleared inside the week. I didn't move in. That isn't what I'd meant, and she'd understood it wasn't. What I did was come back every few days, sometimes to bring supplies she was short on, sometimes just to split wood or look at a fence line that needed attention or sit on her porch in the early evening while the boy ran in the yard. I didn't press for anything. I didn't perform anything. I just came back. Her name had been Adeline Crow, but before that it had been Adeline Beaumont, and she'd grown up in Louisiana near the coast. And she'd come west with her husband when she was 22 because he'd believed there was room out here for a man to make something. He'd been right about the room. He hadn't made it to the something. She told me this on a November evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a lamp between us, the boy long since in bed, the wind back to its old habits outside. I told her about the 30 years of moving. I wasn't proud of it particularly, but I wasn't ashamed of it either. It was what I'd been. She listened without comment and then said she thought most men who moved like that were running from something, and what was I running from? I thought about it. I said I didn't think I was running from anything. I thought I just hadn't had a reason to stop. She looked at me for a moment and said, "And now?" I said, "Now I have 112 acres and good water and a reason." She looked at the lamp. Then she looked at me. Whatever she was deciding, she decided it quietly and to herself, the way she decided most things, and she didn't tell me what it was. But she refilled my coffee. The boy's name was Caleb. He thawed toward me gradually, the way smart children do, not all at once, but in increments, each one a little test. The first thing he asked me was whether I could rope. I said I could. He wanted a demonstration and I gave him one, roping a fence post twice in a row, and after that I was on better standing. He had his mother's way of watching you when he was thinking, the same careful attention, and he asked questions that caught me sideways sometimes, the way children's questions do. He asked me once if I was going to be his father. I was splitting wood at the time. I set them all down and thought about how to answer that honestly without promising something I didn't have the right to promise yet. I said I don't know yet, but I'm not going anywhere. He thought about that. Then he picked up a piece of split wood and carried it to the pile, which I took as acceptance. December brought cold and the first snow, and I was over at her place the day it came in, helping her get the remaining cow into a better shelter I'd built off the side of the house. We worked through the afternoon in the thickening snow, the two of us moving around each other in the way you move around someone you've gotten comfortable with, without bumping, without having to say which way you're going. When we were done, we stood inside the shelter doorway watching the snow come down on the yard, and I could feel the warmth of her standing clothes, and the cow behind us shifting its weight in the new straw. She said, "You didn't have to build this." I said, "I wanted it to be solid." She said, "You do that. You want things to be solid." I looked at her. She was still watching the snow. I said, "Yes." She turned then, just slightly, and looked up at me, and whatever she saw she must have decided was good enough because she reached up and put her hand flat against the side of my face, just held it there a moment, warm against the cold, and then she let it drop and went inside to start supper. I stood there in the doorway for a bit with the snow coming down. That was the whole of it. No declaration, no speech, just her hand on my face, plain and sure, the way she did everything, and me standing in the cold knowing I wasn't going to move from this county for the rest of my life. We married in February. Dill stood up for me at the county clerk's office because I didn't have anyone else, and he'd become something like a friend over the preceding months. Adeline had a neighbor woman, a Mrs. Tarrant who ran a small spread 4 miles north, who stood with her. Caleb wore a coat that was a little too big for him and watched the whole proceeding with the gravity of someone attending to important business. Afterward, Mrs. Tarrant made a cold supper at her place, and we ate it and talked until dark, and then I drove Adeline and Caleb back to her place in my wagon and carried what was left of their things out to my land the following week. Her place I didn't sell. I rented it to a young couple from Kansas who'd come through looking for ground, and the rent paid for the lumber to put the barn right, which I did that spring. The 112 acres didn't stay at 112. By the 3rd year I'd bought the 40 adjacent on the west side, which gave me a better run to the road, and the following year I put up a real house on the rise above the creek, timber-framed, with a proper kitchen and 2 upstairs rooms for when Caleb decided he needed his own space, which he did in about 6 months. I am not writing this down for any particular reason. I don't keep a journal. I've started this more times than I can count, and every time I get back to that night in October, the thin stew and the lean-to and the 50 cents on the step, and I can't get past it without sitting with it a while. She fed a man she'd never seen before everything she had left in the pot. She didn't ask him to pay it back. She didn't ask him anything. She just opened the door because her father had taught her to open the door, and her husband had come through a door like that once and good had come of it. That's all she was doing. And I had been moving for 30 years, ranch to ranch, drive to drive. I'd eaten at a lot of tables and slept in a lot of barns, and I had not stopped at any of them, because none of them had made me feel what that thin bowl of stew in that cold kitchen made me feel, which was a man that someone had opened a door for. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the land or the money or even the wedding in front of Dills and Mrs. Tarrant, just that, the door. She's in the kitchen right now. I can hear her moving around, the familiar sounds of it, the particular way she sets a pan down. Caleb's out with Teobaldo checking the south fence. The creek is running full this week from the snow melt, and in the morning it sounds like something alive. I came into this county with a letter about 80 acres, and a horse that needed shoeing, and a bowl of soup that was the last of what she had. I am still here. That's all of it. That's the whole story. A thrown shoe and a cold night and a woman who opened the door. I have been for the last 4 years the most settled man in this county. I know where everything is. I know the sound my own gate makes. I know the way the light hits the rise above the creek in January when the snow is on it and the sky is that particular gray that isn't quite dark. I know the sound she makes when she's just woken up and hasn't spoken yet, the low morning sound of her. And I know the weight of Caleb's handshake now that he's getting tall, firm like a man's. And I know the smell of this kitchen in the evening when the lamp's been going a while and supper's been cleared, and the whole house has settled into itself. I don't know what I would have done if I'd come by a different road that night, found a different door, or no door, or a door that stayed shut. I don't think about it long. She's calling me in for supper now. That's her voice, the way she says my name across the room, even unhurried, like she knows I'm coming, like she's known it all along. I'm going in.